Chapter 1. Before the Vikings, Scandinavia's roots. Scandinavia was never an easy place to live. Long before the world knew the word Viking, the lands that would become Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were wild, brutal, and cold. Shaped by glaciers and battered by the North Atlantic, the terrain was a mix of dense forests, rocky coastlines, deep fjords, towering mountains, and endless stretches of swamp and tundra. Winters were long, dark, and punishing. Summers were brief and intense, a mad rush to grow, hunt, and store enough to survive the next freeze. Nature didn't forgive mistakes here. It buried them. After the Ice Age retreated around 12,000 years ago, people slowly moved north, chasing herds and fish. These first hunters and gatherers were tough and adaptable. They built simple camps along the coasts and rivers, living off seals, fish, wild berries, and whatever game they could bring down. Over time, they learned the rhythms of this harsh land, migrating with the seasons and respecting its dangers. They shaped tools from stone, bone, and wood. Fire was not just warmth, it was life. It was protection, a weapon, a beacon against the cold and the creatures of the night. By the Bronze Age, roughly 1700 BCE to 500 BCE, Scandinavia had developed its own identity, isolated but not untouched. Long-distance trade had reached even these remote parts. Archaeologists have found bronze objects from Central Europe buried in Scandinavian graves, along with amber, animal pelts, and finely crafted tools. This metal didn't come from local sources. It had to be traded or stolen, evidence of early ambition and networking. Even then, the people of the North understood the value of reaching beyond their shores and seizing what they needed. These societies weren't rich or mighty. They were small, clan-based groups, tied to the land and sea. Status came from ownership of land, control of resources, and personal strength. Leaders were often the ones who could protect their people and lead them through the constant dangers of starvation, sickness, and war. In a world where life could be brutally short, the strongest bonds were blood ties and loyalty forged by hardship. The Iron Age, about 500 BCE onward, changed everything. With iron tools and weapons, farming became more efficient, forests were cleared for larger fields, and warriors became deadlier. Small tribes grew into larger, more organized groups with sharper hierarchies. Fortified settlements sprang up, and some regions developed into proto-kingdoms. Long houses, built from timber and turf, became the center of family life. These weren't palaces, they were practical, rugged structures built to endure storms, snowdrifts, and raiders alike. Religion was rooted in survival. Spirits and gods were everywhere, in the forests, the stones, the rivers, the storms. Offerings were made to ensure good hunts, safe voyages, fertile fields, and victories in battle. Burial sites from this time often show careful rituals, with grave goods meant to aid the dead in whatever came after. Some were sent off in boats, others laid beneath earth mounds. Death was not an ending, but another battle to be prepared for, the ultimate journey. Conflict was constant. Raiding wasn't just for glory, it was a way to survive. If your crops failed or your herds died, you had to take what you needed from others. Alliances were shaky, often made and broken with little warning. Betrayal was common. Honor was not a luxury, it was a necessity. A leader who couldn't defend his people or exact revenge when wronged would quickly lose followers, prestige, and possibly his life. Fear and respect were currencies as real as silver. Geography played a brutal but defining role. Norway's jagged coastlines bred shipbuilders and sailors, men and women who could read the waves like a map. Sweden's deep forests bred hunters and traders who knew how to navigate endless stretches of wilderness. Denmark's flat, fertile lands bred farmers and warriors who could strike quickly across the shallow seas. Mobility became key. Those who could build strong boats and navigate rough waters had an edge that would soon make them legendary. The seeds of the Viking Age were already there. The need to survive, the urge to expand, the drive to explore, and the willingness to fight, all were forged in these early centuries. Scandinavia was a crucible, and those who lived there were tempered by fire, ice, and blood. The very harshness of the environment bred resilience, adaptability, and ambition. As the Roman Empire rose and fell far to the south, Scandinavia remained a hard and isolated world. Roman coins and goods found in burial sites show some contact, but the north was never conquered, never fully absorbed into the empires of the south. It remained stubbornly independent, growing stronger in its own way, forging a different kind of civilization, one built not on cities, but on clans and the sea. When Europe plunged into the chaos of the early Middle Ages, the people of the north saw opportunity, not despair. While kingdoms and empires to the south crumbled, Scandinavians sharpened their weapons, built faster ships, and set their eyes beyond the horizon. They had the skills, they had the hunger, they had the ships. All they needed was a spark, and that spark would soon ignite a wildfire that would sweep across Europe and beyond. And soon, the world would know the storm that had been building for centuries. Chapter 2. The Rise of the Sea Kings. In early Scandinavia, leadership wasn't inherited from thrones or dictated by blood alone. It was taken, kept, and often lost through force, cunning, and alliances. Small tribal chieftains, ruling over villages or scattered settlements, were the seeds of the powerful sea kings who would one day lead Viking fleets across the known world. At first, these chieftains, often called Drottnar in the old tongues, ruled only as far as their voices carried. Their power was personal, built on loyalty, shared bloodlines, and strength in battle. A strong leader could command a handful of villages. A weak one would find himself cast out or killed. Fame and wealth became the tools to expand influence. A chieftain who could lead successful raids or offer plunder to his followers could attract more warriors. The more warriors he had, the bigger his raids became. It was a cycle fueled by ambition, blood, and silver. The sea was the great equalizer. Control of coastal territories meant access to boats, and with boats came mobility. A tribe could double its power overnight if it controlled key ports or trading routes. Early sea kings learned this lesson well. They didn't just rule land, they ruled water. By the late 7th century, certain figures began to stand out. In what would become Denmark, rulers like Ongendus, Angantyr, started to centralize power, uniting clans through a mixture of fear, strategic marriages, and promises of wealth. Ongendus, a figure mentioned by early missionaries, ruled with such brutal efficiency that even foreign chroniclers took notice. Though little is known in detail, he symbolizes the shift, the move from small-time chieftains to serious, centralized power. In Sweden, the Yngling dynasty began to assert control over important territories around Uppsala. They traced their lineage back to gods, an old trick to legitimize rule. But their real strength came from dominating trade routes that stretched deep into the Baltic and even to the rivers of Eastern Europe. Norway, with its fractured geography of fjords and mountains, saw slower consolidation. Small petty kingdoms emerged, Vestfold, Hurdeland, and Rogaland among others. Here, men like Gudrud the Hunter, began to make names for themselves, using fleets to project power across water rather than wasting time battling through the impossible terrain. It was never clean. Assassinations, betrayals, and backstabbing were constants. Marriages were less about love and more about sealing alliances or absorbing rival claims. Sons betrayed fathers. Brothers killed each other over rights to farms, fjords, or fleets. Success was not about birthright alone. It was about who could hold the most swords to their cause. Wealth fueled this expansion. Early leaders realized that raiding monasteries, towns, and rival villages brought in silver, slaves, weapons, and prestige. A leader who could provide rich loot could expect loyalty. A leader who failed would quickly find himself alone. Technology played its part. As shipbuilding improved, with stronger keels, faster hulls, and better sails, the ambitious could strike faster and farther than ever before. Coastal raids became more common, and the villages learned to fear the sight of longships on the horizon. In response, those who could gather fleets and strike first gained an enormous advantage. Religious belief also tied into leadership. Rulers began to claim favor from gods like Odin, the god of war and wisdom. Sacrifices, rituals, and sacred oaths were central to maintaining order. A king who was seen as blessed by the gods could rally more men. A leader who lost too many battles would be seen as cursed, abandoned by the very powers he claimed. By the early 8th century, the title Sea King, Sekonunga, emerged, an unofficial but powerful label. It wasn't about ruling vast inland territories. It was about commanding men and ships. It was about being feared along the coastlines. It was about being the master of the waves. Unlike the kings of Europe, who built castles and collected taxes, the early sea kings were mobile, brutal, and pragmatic. Their courts were not palaces but ships and mead halls. Their justice was swift and final, and their ambitions were never small. In the generation before the famous raids on Lindisfarne, the stage had been set. Scandinavia was dotted with ambitious rulers who had tasted the power of the sea. They had learned how to gather warriors, how to move swiftly, how to raid and retreat before enemy armies could respond. They were not yet the Viking warlords of legend, but they were close. All they needed was a target big enough, rich enough, and weak enough. And soon they would find it. Chapter 3. Life in the Viking Homelands. Viking life wasn't a saga of endless raids and battles. Most of the time, it was a grind of survival, work, and harsh choices. Daily life in Viking Scandinavia was built on farming, building, raising families, and following the unwritten rules that held small communities together. The foundation was the farmstead. Longhouses, the core of Viking architecture, stretched long and low against the landscape, built from timber, stone, and turf. Thick walls and thatched or sod roofs shielded families from bitter winds and snowfall. Inside, a single smoky hall served as kitchen, workshop, sleeping quarters, and meeting place. Animals sometimes shared the space, particularly through the winter months. Most Vikings were farmers. They grew barley, rye, oats, and wheat in small, labor-intensive fields. Farming tools were simple. Wooden ploughs, often pulled by oxen, hand scythes, and digging sticks. Crops had to be hardy to survive short, unpredictable summers. Livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens were prized. Meat supplemented diets heavy in porridge, bread, and fish. Hunting and fishing filled in the gaps, but they were unreliable. Starvation was a constant threat. Seasons dictated everything. Spring meant ploughing and planting. Summer demanded fishing, trading, or raiding. Autumn was for harvest and slaughtering livestock for winter stores. Winter was survival mode, repairing tools, weaving cloth, mending ships, telling stories, and enduring. Viking society was deeply structured but flexible. Free men and women, carls, formed the backbone. They owned farms, paid taxes, could bear arms, and had the right to attend the Thing, the local assembly where laws were made and disputes settled. Above them were the jarls, wealthier landowners and war leaders. At the bottom were thralls, slaves captured in raids or born into bondage, working the fields or serving in households. Freedom was rare but not impossible for thralls. Some could eventually buy or earn their release. Law and order weren't abstract. Without centralized states, justice was local and personal. The Thing was both court and legislature. Disputes over land, honor, debts were argued publicly. Witnesses testified. Compensation was the norm. Fines called weregild could settle blood feuds. But if talks failed, violence was an accepted last resort. Outlaws, stripped of all protections, could be hunted down like animals. Family ties were survival nets. Extended families pooled labor, defended each other, and formed alliances. Marriage was a practical matter, a contract between families to consolidate wealth and labor. Women managed farms when men were away, controlled household economies, and had rights to divorce and property, more rights than many women elsewhere in medieval Europe. Building a life meant building defenses too. Farmsteads often had small defensive ditches or palisades. Coastal settlements kept watch for raiders. Weapons, spears, axes, bows, were household necessities, not luxuries. Every free man was expected to be able to fight. Even children learned to handle weapons from a young age. Religion wove through daily life. Gods like Thor, Odin, and Freya weren't distant. They were companions in struggle. Offerings were made for good harvests, safe voyages, fertility, and victory. Sacred groves, stones, and lakes dotted the landscape. No churches, just nature itself as the temple. Rites of passage, birth, coming of age, marriage, death, were marked with feasts, sacrifices, and storytelling. Craftsmanship was crucial. Viking homesteads were workshops of necessity. Women spun wool and wove cloth. Men forged iron nails, built boats, and carved wooden tools. Trade was lifeblood too. Amber, furs, iron, and slaves went out. Silver, silk, and exotic goods came back. Children grew up fast. Boys learned farming, fighting, shipbuilding. Girls learned managing the household, spinning, brewing, healing. Play was rough and practical. Wrestling, archery, swimming, horseback riding. Childhood was short. Responsibility came early. Community was everything. Isolation was death. Neighboring farmsteads relied on each other in times of sickness, poor harvests, or enemy attack. Festivals, shared labor, marriages, and oath-swearing bound communities tight. But life was never safe. Disease, crop failures, raids, internal disputes, any of these could end a family line in a single bad season. Strength, resilience, and cunning were survival traits. Luck mattered too. When the sea, kings, and raiders left their homes to seek riches abroad, they came from this world, a world of hard people forged by harder lands. The Viking warrior spirit wasn't born on distant battlefields. It was hammered into shape in smoky longhouses, rocky fields, and freezing winters where survival itself was a daily battle. Chapter 4. The First Raids, England and Beyond. The first Viking raids weren't grand invasions. They were sharp, brutal strikes, designed for quick loot, not conquest. They came without warning, hit hard, and vanished before a defense could be mustered. In a world where news travelled slower than ships, the first raiders seemed to materialize out of the mist like ghosts. The reasons were clear. Scandinavia's population was growing, land was scarce, and ambitious men wanted more wealth and status than their farms could provide. European monasteries and coastal towns, isolated, wealthy, and poorly defended, offered perfect targets. Silver, gold, relics, and slaves could be taken in a matter of hours. The attack on Lindisfarne in 793 CE is the most famous starting point, but it was not the first raid. Viking ships had likely tested European shores for decades, raiding isolated settlements in Scotland and Ireland, or probing the defences of the Frankish coast. But Lindisfarne shocked the world. It was a sacred place, a monastery known for learning and peace, and it was laid bare in a single day. Eyewitness accounts describe heathens storming ashore, smashing altars, killing monks, and looting treasures. The psychological impact far outweighed the material loss. A place thought protected by God had fallen to men who worshipped foreign gods with no respect for Christian sanctity. Tactically, the raids were simple but devastating. Longships, fast and shallow drafted, could navigate rivers and land almost anywhere. Beaches, estuaries, even fields at high tide. Crews were small, agile units of 30 to 60 warriors, capable of striking in minutes and retreating before any real defense could organize. The mobility of the Vikings was their deadliest weapon. Targets were chosen for vulnerability, not size. Wealthy monasteries, lonely manor houses, poorly defended villages, all were fair game. Raiders avoided large walled cities early on. Speed and surprise were key. They came at dawn, or under the cover of fog. They struck while locals slept or prayed. Europe was completely unprepared. Most coastal defences were pitiful, if they existed at all. Armies, such as they were, moved slowly, needed days or weeks to gather, and were often tied to feudal obligations that Vikings simply sidestepped. By the time a local lord could organize a militia, the raiders would already be back at sea. The early raids were seasonal. Vikings struck during the summer months when seas were calmer. Fields were rich for pillaging, and return voyages were safer. The rhythm of the raids mirrored the seasons of Scandinavia. Sow, raid, harvest, survive. As word spread of easy riches, more ships joined. What began as isolated attacks grew into larger expeditions. Coastal settlements fortified their churches and built watchtowers. Kingdoms began raising fleets and coastal defences. But it was too late to stop the momentum. In Ireland, monasteries at Lambay Island and Inishmurray fell. Along the coasts of Francia, modern France, small ports and riverside towns were harassed. Even as rulers like Charlemagne built his empire, he could not stop the raiders from reaching into his realm. To the Vikings, it wasn't evil. It was business. It was survival. It was opportunity. And success bred ambition. As raiders returned home laden with silver, slaves, and exotic goods, their prestige skyrocketed. Young warriors flocked to leaders who could promise rich plunder. Kings and jarls back in Scandinavia realized raiding could fund power at home, fueling the rise of larger war bands and eventually leading to outright invasions. Monasteries learned to hide their treasures. Some coastal towns paid tribute, protection money, to avoid being sacked. Others were simply abandoned. The fear of Viking sails kept entire regions on edge. Priests prayed desperately for divine protection, but the raiders kept coming. The early raids shaped Viking identity. They proved that a small, well-led force could humble kingdoms. They reinforced the belief that fate and personal strength determined success. They established the rules of the coming age. Be fast, be ruthless, be gone before the enemy even knows what's happening. Europe had been caught sleeping. The Vikings had found their weakness, and this was only the beginning. Chapter 5. The Siege of Paris and Expansion West. The early Viking raids had been about speed and plunder, but ambition grew. By the mid-9th century, the Vikings weren't just raiders. They were organized forces capable of taking on cities, kingdoms, and empires. Nowhere was this clearer than at Paris in 845 CE. Ragnar Lodbrok, whether legendary or real, led a fleet of 120 longships up the River Seine. Estimates suggest he commanded around 5,000 men, a staggering number compared to earlier raiding bands. This wasn't a smash and grab, it was a military campaign. The strategy was simple: strike at the heart. Paris, though fortified, was vulnerable from the river. The city was split across islands, with wooden bridges tying it together. Viking ships could sail right up to the city's doorstep, and no army could assemble fast enough to block them. As they advanced, Ragnar's men devastated everything in their path. Towns and villages along the Seine were sacked, burned, and left as ruins. Resistance was piecemeal and crushed brutally. Fear travelled faster than the longships themselves. When the Viking fleet reached Paris, the Franks were paralysed. King Charles the Bald scrambled to defend the city, but his forces were fragmented. Ragnar captured 111 prisoners and hanged them in public, a savage warning. The message was clear: pay or perish. Charles chose to pay. A ransom of 7,000 pounds of silver and gold, a fortune, was delivered to Ragnar. Only then did the Vikings retreat, heavy with loot. The siege of Paris exposed the soft underbelly of the Carolingian Empire and proved that even the heart of a Christian kingdom was not safe. The consequences rippled out. Viking leaders saw the rewards of bigger, coordinated attacks. Raiding evolved into large-scale campaigns. Francia, modern-day France and Germany, suffered repeatedly. Viking armies wintered on foreign soil, building fortified camps called long forts to launch deeper attacks when spring came. In England, the pattern was similar. Small raids escalated into full invasions. By 865 CE, the Great Heathen Army, a massive Viking force, landed in East Anglia, aiming not for loot, but for conquest. They moved systematically, seizing towns, toppling kings, forcing payments. Ireland, too, became a battleground. Viking fleets founded settlements that would later become major cities: Dublin, Waterford, Limerick. These were not just raider camps. They were economic hubs, trading slaves, silver, and goods across the Atlantic world. The expansion west was driven by ambition and opportunity. Scandinavian leaders realized that they could carve out territories, not just plunder them. Land, trade, and political power were now on the table. Viking tactics adapted. They used rivers like highways, striking deep into territory. They forged alliances with local rulers, sometimes fighting, sometimes marrying into power structures. They played enemies against each other, and when needed, they burned everything to the ground. But with expansion came resistance. Fortifications improved. Cities like Paris eventually built stone bridges and stronger defences. Kings like Alfred the Great in England learned to fight back with fortified towns, mobile armies, and coastal fleets. Still, for decades, the Vikings dictated the terms of war. Their blend of speed, ruthlessness, and adaptability kept them a step ahead. The Siege of Paris wasn't just a victory, it was a blueprint. It showed that with enough force and boldness, nothing in Europe was beyond Viking reach. It set off a wave of further campaigns, settlements, and lasting influence. By the end of the 9th century, Vikings weren't just invaders. They were rulers, settlers, and kingmakers across the Western world. The dragon-proud ships had crossed a line, and Europe would never be the same. Chapter 6: Settlements and Colonies. Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland. The Vikings were raiders, yes, but they were also settlers. When land grew scarce and rival kings tightened their grip on Scandinavia, many Vikings turned their sails westward not for loot, but for land. Iceland was the first major leap. Around 870 CE, Norse settlers, mostly from Norway, began arriving. Some were seeking freedom from the heavy hand of King Harald Fairhair, who was consolidating power through force. Others were looking for new opportunities or escaping blood feuds and overpopulation. Iceland offered wide open spaces, rich fishing waters and fertile valleys, at least compared to the rocky fjords of Norway. But the reality was harsher than the dream. Volcanic soil meant farming was difficult. Winters were brutal. Settlers built turf houses to survive the cold and established small, isolated communities. They brought livestock, grain, and the Old Norse laws. By 930 CE, they formed the Althing, one of the world's oldest parliamentary institutions, to govern themselves without kings, a fierce statement of independence. Greenland was the next gamble. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, led settlers west around 985 CE. He named it Greenland to make it sound more appealing, but the name was a cruel joke. Only the edges of the massive ice-covered island were marginally habitable. Life in Greenland was a constant fight. Thin coastal strips were carved into pastures for sheep and cattle. Trade with Iceland and Norway kept the settlements alive, supplying timber and iron in exchange for walrus ivory and furs. But the margin for survival was razor thin. A few bad winters, a failed harvest, or a supply ship lost to storms could mean death. Vinland, North America, was the boldest frontier. According to sagas like the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed west around 1000 CE. They found a land rich in timber, grapes, and game, a sharp contrast to Greenland's scarcity. They called it Vinland, and they tried to settle it, but it was not empty. Native peoples, referred to as Skraelings in the sagas, fought back. Clashes were bloody and frequent. Outnumbered, isolated and far from reinforcements, the Norse settlers abandoned their outposts after a few years. The risks were enormous. Settlers faced starvation, disease, hostile climates, and violent conflicts. Supply lines were fragile, stretching across storm-racked seas. Even small mistakes could spiral into disaster. But the motivations were just as strong. Land ownership in Scandinavia was rigid. Younger sons had little chance of inheriting property. Political centralization under kings like Harald Fairhair pushed out independent-minded farmers and warriors. And the Viking spirit, that drive to seek, to risk, to carve a life from the unknown, burned hot. Colonization wasn't an organized state project. It was individuals, families, and small bands striking out into the unknown, relying on grit, luck, and community ties. Success was measured not by riches, but by survival. Iceland endured and grew. Greenland held on for centuries, but eventually collapsed under a combination of climate change, isolation, and economic decline. Vinland faded into legend, its brief flicker of Norse presence in the New World lost to time. Still, the Viking settlements pushed the boundaries of the known world. They showed that Norse ambition wasn't confined to raiding. It could build as well as destroy. It could dream beyond horizons most Europeans of the time never dared imagine. The same fierce independence that fueled their raids also fueled their colonization, and left a mark on history that still echoes today. Chapter 7. Vikings in the East, the Rus and Byzantium. The Vikings didn't just look west. They also turned east, sailing rivers instead of seas, carving paths deep into the heart of Europe and Asia. In the east, they were called the Rus, a name that would eventually give rise to Russia. The journey started with rivers like the Neva, Volkhov, and Dnieper, flowing through dense forests and vast plains. Using shallow draft longships, the Vikings could sail upriver, portage their ships overland, and continue deeper inland. It was slow, grueling work, but the rewards were too great to ignore. Fur, amber, wax, honey, slaves. The East was rich with goods that could be sold in the markets of Byzantium, the great city of Constantinople, or across the Islamic world. Silver flowed through these routes, and the Norsemen wanted it. They didn't come as simple raiders. In the East, diplomacy mattered as much as warfare. Viking leaders forged alliances with Slavic tribes, Baltic peoples, and Finno-Ugric groups. They married into local families, established fortified trading posts, and demanded tribute. Where negotiation failed, they burned villages and took what they needed by force. Around the mid-9th century, the Rus began to consolidate power. According to the primary chronicle, the Varangians, Vikings, were invited to rule over the disorganized Slavic tribes. Rurik, a Norse chieftain, established control over Novgorod around 862 CE. His successors, including Oleg of Novgorod, expanded southward, seizing Kiev and creating the foundation of Kievan Rus, the first real state in the region. The Rus became brokers between the north and the great empires of the south. Furs and slaves were ferried downriver to Byzantine markets. In return, they brought back silk, wine, jewelry, and gold. Norse warriors served as mercenaries, bodyguards, and merchants. They adopted Slavic languages and customs while maintaining their Norse identity. Relations with Byzantium were a careful dance of threat and partnership. The Rus launched multiple attacks on Constantinople itself, notably in 860 and again in 907. Viking fleets sailed boldly into the Bosphorus, attempting to force tribute from the richest city in the world. When brute force failed, negotiation followed. Treaties were struck. Trade agreements allowed Rus merchants to do business in Constantinople under strict conditions. Rus leaders swore oaths at churches and over sacred relics, blending Norse custom with Byzantine ceremony. Some Vikings entered Byzantine service directly. The Varangian Guard, an elite unit of the Byzantine army, was made up largely of Norse warriors. They were prized for their loyalty and ferocity. Standing 6 feet tall or more, armed with massive axes, they became a feared and respected force in the imperial court. Cultural exchange was inevitable. Norse craftsmanship absorbed Eastern influences. Christian missionaries began to move north, planting seeds of conversion that would bloom generations later. Coins, jewelry, weapons, and art show a mix of Scandinavian and Slavic Byzantine styles. But the brutality never vanished. Slavery was central to the Eastern trade. Viking traders captured and sold thousands of Slavic men, women, and children across the Islamic world. The word slave itself comes from Slav, a grim reminder of the human cost of these ventures. The East offered the Vikings more than just wealth. It offered power, legitimacy, and a new identity. The Rus became rulers in their own right, building cities, forging alliances, and shaping the destiny of Eastern Europe. By sailing the rivers and striking deals, sometimes with sword in hand, sometimes with open palm, the Vikings carved out a place in a world far removed from the cold seas of their homeland. And in doing so, they helped create new nations that would outlast even their own. Chapter 8. The Warrior Culture, Weapons, Ships, and Warfare. Viking warfare wasn't about chivalry or honor duels. It was about winning, fast, brutal, and efficient. Every Viking free man was expected to fight, and most were ready to do so at a moment's notice. War was part of life, as normal as farming or fishing. The shield was the heart of Viking combat. Round, made from wood with an iron boss at the center, the shield was light enough to move quickly, but strong enough to stop a sword or spear. Warriors often formed shield walls, a tight, disciplined formation where shields overlapped, creating a nearly impenetrable barrier. It was a test of stamina and nerve. Battles often devolved into brutal pushes, where men hacked at exposed limbs and tried to break the enemy line. Axes were the most iconic Viking weapons. They came in many forms, from small hand axes, perfect for throwing, to the massive Dane axe, used with two hands. Axes were cheap to make, deadly in close quarters, and could punch through shields and armor. Swords were rarer, expensive status symbols. A good sword was named, handed down through generations, and sometimes buried with its owner. Spears, however, were the most common battlefield weapon, easy to craft, versatile, and deadly both thrown or thrust. Helmets and armor were less universal. A lucky warrior might own a conical iron helmet with a nose guard, but most made do with boiled leather or thick padded tunics. Chainmail was valuable and rare, usually reserved for the wealthy or for elite warriors. Mobility mattered. Heavy armor slowed you down, and in the chaos of Viking warfare, speed could be the difference between life and death. The ships were weapons too. Longships were masterpieces of engineering, long, narrow, and fast. Shallow drafts allowed them to sail up rivers and land on almost any beach. Crews could carry ships over land when needed. The dragon-prowed ships inspired fear long before the first blade was drawn. Viking raids depended on surprise and mobility. They struck at dawn or under fog cover, moving fast and leaving before reinforcements could arrive. Speed was everything. A successful raid was one where the enemy never had time to organize. Battles in the Viking Age were short, violent affairs. Few stood and fought to the death. If one side's shield wall broke, the losing side usually fled. Pursuit was deadly. Captured warriors might be ransomed, enslaved, or executed depending on the victor's mood. Siege warfare was rarer but not unknown. Vikings used simple battering rams, ladders, and fire. They preferred to starve a settlement out rather than waste lives in frontal assaults. In some cases, they simply bypassed strongholds and focused on softer targets. Psychological warfare played a big role. The reputation of Viking brutality preceded them. Tales of monasteries burned, kings slain, and entire villages enslaved travelled ahead of their fleets. Fear weakened defences before the first sword was drawn. Viking warriors valued loyalty to their leaders, bravery in battle, and the promise of fame. Dying in battle was considered an honourable death, one that could secure a place in Valhalla. But romanticising it misses the reality. Most fought not for glory, but for survival, for loot, and for the future of their families. Training started young. Boys learned to wield weapons, row ships, and endure hardships. Strength and endurance were survival skills. Those who couldn't keep up were left behind. Discipline mattered. Viking war bands operated under strict leadership. A failed raid could mean starvation. A misjudged battle could mean annihilation. Leaders who botched campaigns didn't last long, often killed or abandoned by their own men. Even in victory, the reality was harsh. Wounds meant infection. Medical care was basic at best. A victorious warrior might die days later from injuries or disease. There were no guarantees. Every raid, every battle was a gamble. War was how Vikings made their mark on the world, not by fighting fair, but by fighting smart, hard, and with relentless purpose. It was not noble, it was necessary. Chapter 9. Gods, Myths, and Beliefs. Norse religion. For the Vikings, religion wasn't about temples or quiet prayers. It was woven into the land, the sea, the air, a living force that shaped daily life, death, and everything in between. Belief wasn't abstract. It was practical. It was survival. The Norse gods were not distant creators. They were warriors, wanderers, tricksters, and lovers. They mirrored the world the Vikings lived in. Beautiful, but brutal, full of hard choices and inevitable death. Odin, the All-Father, stood at the top. God of wisdom, war, and death, he sacrificed an eye for knowledge and hung himself from the world tree, Yggdrasil, to learn the secrets of the runes. He was not a kind god. He was ruthless, wise, and always scheming. Warriors prayed to Odin not for safety, but for victory and glory. Thor, the thunder god, was the people's protector. With his hammer, Mjolnir, he fought the giants, the forces of chaos that threatened order. Farmers, sailors, and common folk favored Thor. His hammer was a symbol of strength and protection, worn as amulets and carved into stones. Freya, goddess of love, fertility, and battle, held sway over life and death. Half the warriors who died in battle went to her hall, not Odin's. She embodied the harshness and beauty of the Viking world, life that could give joy and take it away just as quickly. The afterlife was not a promise of peace. It was a continuation of the fight. The bravest warriors hoped to die sword in hand and be chosen for Valhalla, Odin's hall, where they would feast and fight until the end of the world. Cowards and those who died of sickness or old age might end up in hell, a dreary, cold underworld ruled by the goddess Hel, daughter of Loki. Ragnarok, the end of the world, loomed over everything. The gods themselves were doomed to die in a final, cataclysmic battle against the forces of chaos. It was not something to fear. It was inevitable. Courage meant standing your ground even knowing you would lose. Religious practices were raw and direct. Blot, sacrifices, were offered to the gods, spirits, and ancestors. Animals were slaughtered, sometimes humans, in sacred groves or near special stones. Blood was sprinkled on altars, statues, and the worshippers themselves. Seers and Volur, female prophets, held important roles. They spoke with the spirits, read omens, and guided leaders. Magic, known as Seder, was a dark and respected art, used for cursing enemies, blessing voyages, or foreseeing the future. Nature itself was sacred. Mountains, rivers, trees, and stones could be homes to land spirits, the Landvetir. Disturbing them could bring disaster. Respect for the unseen world was deeply ingrained. There was no central church, no holy book. Belief was local, communal, and oral. Myths and sagas passed from mouth to mouth, changing with each telling but keeping the core truths alive. Religion bound Viking communities together. Oaths were sworn before gods. Treaties were sealed with sacrifices. Justice often invoked divine witness. Faith in the gods and fate gave meaning to the risks they took. Sailing unknown seas, facing death in battle, enduring hunger and cold. The Norse didn't pray for salvation. They prayed for strength, wisdom, and luck, the tools they needed to survive and succeed in a harsh world. Their gods were their reflection, flawed, fierce, and unbreakable, even in the face of certain doom. Chapter 10. Women in Viking Society. Viking women weren't silent figures in the background. They worked, fought, traded, and ruled when circumstances demanded it. They were critical to survival and success in a harsh world, and they wielded real power, though not always the kind sung about in sagas. At home, women managed the farmstead. While men sailed off to raid, trade, or fight, women controlled the household economy, the food stores, livestock, spinning, weaving, and brewing. A woman's control over these resources gave her genuine authority. In many ways, she was the core of Viking society's daily survival. Property rights for women were stronger in Viking society than in much of medieval Europe. Women could inherit land, own property, and pass it on to their descendants. They could initiate divorce, reclaim their dowries, and defend their rights in court. Marriage was a contract between families, negotiated over land, alliances, and status. Women were expected to uphold family honor, but weren't simply pawns. Strong-willed women could influence negotiations and push for favorable matches. Widowhood, often after men died on voyages or in battle, was not the end of a woman's agency. Widows often became heads of households and wielded considerable economic and social clout. In trade, women were active participants. Archaeological finds, such as burial sites with scales, weights, and foreign goods, suggest that women took part in commerce, managing markets, and even long-distance trading ventures. Religion and spiritual life also gave women prominent roles. Female seers and priestesses performed rituals, read omens, and advised chieftains. The vulva, a woman who practiced Seder, magic and prophecy, commanded fear and respect, able to shape the decisions of leaders and warriors alike. Warfare was mostly a man's domain, but not exclusively. Sagas tell of shield maidens, women who took up arms and fought alongside men. Whether these figures were common is debated, but burials like the one in Birka, Sweden, a high-status grave containing weapons, gaming pieces, and the remains of a woman, suggest that at least some women held warrior status. However, Viking society was still patriarchal. Political leadership and inheritance lines favored men. Women who wielded power often did so through family ties, as daughters, wives, mothers, or widows of powerful men. Violence against women existed too. Slavery was a brutal reality, and many of the thralls captured during raids were women, exploited for labor and worse. Not all women lived as landowners or merchants. Many lived hard, short lives at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Yet, within the harsh structure of Viking society, women carved out space for influence, resilience, and sometimes leadership. They were negotiators, workers, religious leaders, and, on rare occasions, warriors. The image of Viking women isn't one of passive figures waiting at home. It's of people who carried the weight of survival on their shoulders, made choices that shaped families and communities, and left their mark on a world that demanded strength from everyone, regardless of gender. Chapter 11. Trade, Treasure, and the Viking Economy. Viking wealth wasn't built on raiding alone. While raiding made headlines then and now, trade, craftsmanship, and careful economic networks kept Viking societies alive and growing. Their economy was wide-ranging, pragmatic, and always driven by opportunity. Raiding was quick cash. A successful raid could net silver, gold, livestock, weapons, slaves, and luxury goods. Monasteries and isolated towns made tempting targets, often yielding a fortune in a single strike. Ransoms were common. Entire towns paid Danegeld to Vikings to avoid destruction, essentially a bribe to be left alone. But raiding had limits. It was risky, seasonal, and relied on fast, brutal action. Sustaining wealth meant turning plunder into trade, relationships, and long-term profits. Trade was the real engine of the Viking economy. Viking merchants travelled as far as Baghdad, Constantinople, and the markets of Spain. They moved goods like furs, amber, iron, walrus ivory, and slaves in exchange for silk, spices, wine, jewellery, and especially silver. The importance of silver cannot be overstated. Silver was the lifeblood of Viking commerce. It wasn't just hoarded. It was cut, weighed, and used in everyday transactions. Archaeological finds like the Querdal hoard in England, over 40 kilograms of silver, and massive stashes found in Gotland show how central silver was. Craftsmanship fueled both self-sufficiency and luxury trade. Viking smiths produced iron tools, weapons, jewelry, and ship parts. Woodworkers built the famous longships, which were technological masterpieces of speed and durability. Textile production was vital too. Viking woolen cloth was highly prized and often used as a trade good. Markets sprung up around trading hubs. Birka, Sweden, Hedeby, Denmark, Kaupang, Norway, and Dublin, Ireland, were vibrant centres where Norse traders met merchants from across Europe and beyond. These towns bustled with activity, weighing goods, forging deals, and exchanging news. Slavery was a grim but vital part of the economy. Vikings captured thousands of people in raids and sold them into slavery across the Islamic world and Europe. Thralls were used for farm labour, domestic service, or resold for profit. Wealth fueled power. A chieftain's or king's ability to reward followers with silver, land, weapons, and gifts determined his strength. Generosity, ring-giving, was not charity. It was investment. It bought loyalty and muscle when needed. The Viking economy wasn't cash-based like today's systems. Barter was common, with set values for goods. A sword might be worth several cows. A ship's worth could be measured in dozens of slaves. Taxes existed too, a blend of tribute, fees, and expected gifts. Chiefs and kings collected goods, services, or silver to maintain their households and armies. Failure to pay often meant brutal consequences. The economic drive pushed Vikings into new territories. Settlements like Iceland and Greenland weren't just escapes from political pressure. They were expansions of trade networks. Even Vinland, in North America, was valued for its timber and resources. By the 10th century, many Vikings had shifted from raiders to merchants. Some former raiders settled in areas like Normandy, Ireland, and England, where they established trade towns and intermarried with locals. Artifacts tell the story clearly. Scales, weights, foreign coins, and diverse goods found in Viking graves show an economy rooted in calculation, risk-taking, and pragmatism. Wealth was measured by what you could carry, trade, or protect with a sword. Vikings didn't just take. They built networks that stretched across continents. They understood that silver could buy a sword, but a sword could also buy a kingdom. Chapter 12. The fall of the Great Heathen Army. The Great Heathen Army wasn't a myth or a romantic brotherhood. It was a massive Viking invasion force, organized, ruthless, and for a time, unstoppable. In 865 CE, the army landed in East Anglia, England, led by figures like Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubbe, the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok. It wasn't just another raiding party. It was a full-blown attempt at conquest. England at the time was fractured. The four major kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex, were vulnerable, divided by old rivalries and weak leadership. The Vikings moved with brutal efficiency. They first secured East Anglia, forcing local rulers to supply horses. With mobility secured, they advanced north. In 866, they seized York, the heart of Northumbria. A year later, they crushed a Northumbrian attempt to retake it. Kings Alla and Osbert were killed. Alla, according to legend, met a grisly fate through the Blood Eagle execution, though historians debate its reality. From York, the army swept south. Mercia fell under pressure, and the Vikings extracted tribute rather than waste effort holding it. East Anglia was subdued. Only Wessex, under King Alfred the Great, put up meaningful resistance. Battles were constant. In 871, Alfred's forces clashed with the Vikings repeatedly. Victory swung back and forth, but Alfred adapted. He fortified towns, burhs, improved the English army's mobility, and wore the Vikings down through attrition and defensive warfare. The Great Heathen Army splintered. Some leaders died. Others, like Halfdan, turned north, fighting in Ireland and Scotland. Internal divisions grew. Ambitions clashed. By 878, the Viking momentum broke at the Battle of Edington. Alfred defeated Guthrum's Viking army and forced a peace treaty. Guthrum accepted baptism and settled in East Anglia. Parts of England remained under Viking control, the Danelaw, but the dream of total conquest was dead. Why did the Great Heathen Army fail? First, they stretched themselves too thin. Holding land is harder than raiding it. Garrisoning towns, defending territory, and maintaining supply lines over hostile countryside sapped their strength. Second, Alfred adapted. He refused to meet them on their terms, avoiding direct battle unless he held the advantage. His network of fortified burhs made sudden Viking attacks less effective. Third, leadership fractures weakened the Vikings. With leaders dying, splitting off, or chasing their own agendas, the unity that made the early campaign so deadly dissolved. The Vikings didn't disappear. They dug into the Danelaw, farming, trading, and marrying into the local populations. But the Great Surge, the vision of England falling entirely under Norse rule, failed. The Great Heathen Army had come close. They reshaped England, left permanent marks on its language, law, and culture. But in the end, conquest slipped through their fingers, undone by logistics, resilience, and their own ambition. No songs could hide that hard truth. Even the fiercest warriors have limits. Chapter 13. The Christianization of the North. The conversion of Viking Scandinavia to Christianity wasn't a single event. It was a slow, messy, political process that stretched over centuries, and it was often less about faith than about power. At first, Christianity was a foreign religion, the faith of enemies and victims. Early Viking raiders saw churches and monasteries not as sacred spaces, but as soft, wealthy targets. Yet even during these raids, the seeds of change were being planted. Along trading routes and in conquered territories, Vikings came into contact with Christian merchants, rulers, and ideas. Trade demanded diplomacy. Diplomacy often demanded baptism. Viking leaders who wanted to do business or secure alliances with Christian kings agreed to be baptized, sometimes multiple times, depending on who they were dealing with. For many, it was a political tool, not a personal revelation. By the 10th century, some rulers realized that Christianity could help consolidate their power. Paganism was decentralized. Local gods, local customs. Christianity offered hierarchy, literacy, and the backing of powerful European allies. Harold Bluetooth of Denmark was a major figure. Around 960 CE, he declared Denmark Christian by force, according to the gelling stones he erected. In reality, the transition was incomplete and resisted. Rural areas clung to the old gods for generations. In Norway, King Olaf Tryggvason took a more violent approach around 995 CE. He demanded conversion at sword point, burning pagan temples and killing those who refused baptism. His successor, Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf, continued the push, mixing politics with missionary work. Sweden's conversion lagged behind. Central power was weaker there, and old faiths held strong, especially in places like Uppsala, home to a major pagan temple. It wasn't until the 11th century that Christianity took real hold, and even then, it was a patchwork. Some areas converted quickly, others resisted for decades. Cultural shifts followed political ones. Churches replaced sacred groves. Burial customs changed. Grave goods disappeared, and simple Christian graves became standard. Norse myths faded from public life, surviving only in isolated oral traditions that would later be written down by Christian scholars. The old and new beliefs often mixed. Early Christian Vikings still carved runestones and used pagan imagery. Some wore Thor's hammers alongside crosses. It wasn't a clean break. It was a slow evolution. Resistance never fully disappeared. Some rebelled, others quietly kept old practices alive under the surface. The process varied region by region, family by family. It wasn't a mass conversion. It was a slow surrender, often driven more by necessity than belief. By the 12th century, Scandinavia was officially Christian. Cathedrals rose where longhouses once stood. Kings now ruled by the grace of God, not by blood and blade alone. But the old spirit, the fierce independence, the respect for strength, the grim acceptance of fate, didn't vanish. It simply adapted to the new order. Christianity had conquered Scandinavia, but the Vikings had left their mark on Christianity too, shaping it to fit a people who had lived too long under hard skies to be easily remade. Chapter 14. The End of the Viking Age. The Viking Age didn't end with a bang. It faded out, ground down by changes both at home and abroad. Internally, Scandinavia changed. Kings consolidated power across Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Where once there had been dozens of petty chieftains vying for dominance, now there were centralized monarchies that demanded loyalty, taxes, and obedience. Individual raiding bands became liabilities, not assets, for rulers trying to stabilize their realms. Christianity also reshaped the north. As the old pagan codes gave way to Christian law and order, raiding, especially against fellow Christian lands, became harder to justify. Leaders who had once gloried in plunder now sought legitimacy from the church. Holy warriors replaced sea raiders. Economically, Scandinavia had better options. As trade networks grew stronger and more reliable, there was less need to risk dangerous raids. Merchants could get rich selling furs, timber, iron, and slaves without having to pick up a sword. Meanwhile, Europe got smarter. Monasteries fortified themselves. Towns built stone walls. Kings organized faster, better trained armies. Coastal defenses improved, making surprise raids harder to pull off. The quick, brutal tactics that had once made Vikings feared across the continent became less effective. New political structures also made a difference. In England, the unification of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under rulers like Alfred the Great, and later the formation of a more centralized kingdom, meant better defense and retaliation. In Francia, fortified cities and standing armies blunted Viking incursions. Military technology evolved. Castles and fortified towns dotted the landscape. Cavalry became more dominant, and heavy infantry tactics made shield walls less invincible. The raiding model that had fueled Viking success was slowly choked off by stronger defenses and smarter opponents. Finally, there was simple exhaustion. After 2 centuries of expansion, conquest, and colonization, the Vikings had spread themselves thin. They had established kingdoms in England, Ireland, Normandy, and parts of Russia. They weren't invaders anymore. They were rulers, settlers, farmers, and traders. The age of heroic sea kings and raiding fleets gave way to the mundane realities of governance and survival. There are symbolic milestones. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, where King Harold Godwinson defeated the Norwegian King Harald Hardrada, is often marked as the end of the Viking Age, but by then, the Viking world had already transformed beyond recognition. The spirit of exploration and conquest didn't vanish. It evolved. Scandinavian powers shifted focus toward crusading, state-building, and participation in broader European politics. The Viking Age ended not because the Vikings were defeated in one dramatic clash, but because the world changed, and they changed with it. The restless energy that had once driven longships across oceans now found new channels. The dragon prows were pulled ashore. The war cries faded into memory, and the Norsemen became something new. Kings, Christians, Europeans. Chapter 15. The Viking Legacy: How They Changed the World. The Vikings didn't just leave burned towns and looted monasteries behind. They reshaped Europe in ways that lasted far longer than their raids. In law and governance, Vikings brought new ideas. The concept of the Thing, a public assembly where free men debated laws and settled disputes, influenced the development of legal systems in places like England and Iceland. Traditions of local governance, trial by jury, and community consensus owe part of their DNA to Norse customs. Trade networks expanded dramatically because of Viking activity. They connected the icy shores of Scandinavia to the markets of Baghdad, Constantinople, and beyond. Goods like furs, amber, iron, walrus ivory, and slaves flowed south. Silk, spices, and silver came north. The Viking Age helped knit together a more interconnected medieval economy. Exploration was another legacy. Vikings were the first Europeans to reach North America, nearly 500 years before Columbus. Even though their settlements in Vinland were short-lived, their voyages proved the Atlantic could be crossed. Their mapping of coastlines and exploration of rivers opened new possibilities for later generations. Viking settlements changed the demographic and political landscape of Europe. In England, Norse influence reshaped language, place names, and even bloodlines. Towns like York, from Jorvik, grew into thriving urban centres under Viking rule. In France, Viking settlers in Normandy adapted quickly, eventually becoming one of medieval Europe's most formidable powers, culminating in the Norman conquest of England in 1066. Culturally, the Norse worldview left a deep imprint. Their sagas, written down centuries later, became key pieces of world literature. Gritty, unsentimental stories of fate, struggle, loyalty, and loss. Viking mythology, stripped of its religious weight, continued to inspire art, literature, and identity centuries after Scandinavia had fully Christianized. They brought shipbuilding innovations, sleek, fast designs that influenced European naval architecture. Their emphasis on speed, shallow drafts, and mobility reshaped how navies thought about warfare and exploration. Even their failures mattered. The pressure they exerted on European kingdoms helped push political centralization. England, in particular, was forced to unite under strong rulers in response to Viking threats, laying groundwork for the later English state. The Vikings were not flawless adventurers or mythic heroes. They were practical, often brutal, sometimes visionary. They were survivors, builders, destroyers, and creators. They helped end the isolation of early medieval Europe. They challenged stagnant political orders. They pushed the boundaries of what was possible in exploration and trade. Long after the last dragon-prowed longship rotted away, the world the Vikings helped shape endured, in law, language, borders, and culture. Their legacy isn't in the legends, it's in the world we still live in.